Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. So, we'll be moving into the last 25 years of our history. And as a reminder, I can turn that on. You're going to turn it on. Okay.
I know how to do that.
I know. You're very good at that. I'm going to set it out here. As a reminder, we will have the next 2 Sundays no Sunday school class. So we have a little break for the next 2 Sundays. Obviously, next Sunday is Memorial Day weekend. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. And then the Sunday after that is our big 75th anniversary, and we'll have a picnic and do all that stuff. If you get a chance and want to step into the kitchen at some point, you can look in the backyard. The slab is poured for our new pergola area out there, so you can take a look at that. And then the Sunday after that, so the second Sunday in June, we'll be joined by Dr. Lisa Wolf, Lisa is a UCC pastor, one of my colleagues from back in the Oklahoma City days, is an instructor at OCU and in Hebrew Bible, and we'll be teaching a class on Ecclesiastes, which should be fun. It's a collection of wisdom, and Lisa's a wonderful teacher and a fun person. So she'll be doing that. I think maybe one of the classes is hybrid, like she'll be on the screen, but I think she's here in person for at least 2 of those sessions. But Justin knows all those answers. I don't know. So yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. And maybe it's Justin doing the last session. I can't remember. Ecclesiastes, Lisa Wolf is involved somehow, and it starts the second Sunday in June. That much I'm very certain of. But we're going to talk about the last 25 years of Fellowship's history. I'm not very familiar with this part of the history, so we'll just have to piecemeal our way through it. So obviously I can tell you a lot about the last 12 years of that, but there was a portion before that I have some personal tangential relationship to Fellowship, because that was about the time that I was starting into ministry myself and began to know of this congregation and to get to know Paul Ashby, who was the pastor then during my time with the Kansas-Oklahoma Conference. So you can take a little nap right now if you want to, but the little piece of history that's important in that is that we, as a conference, we used to have another layer. We used to have what were called associations. So the association was at a state level. So we had an Oklahoma association, which was all the churches in Oklahoma, and then there were 4 associations in Kansas because there were more churches there. So they were directional associations in Kansas. And then those associations made decisions, and then they took them to the conference, which was Kansas and Oklahoma, and then they went up to the national. And that's how the structure used to be. And that structure is still in place in some parts of the nation. But here, we didn't have enough people, essentially, to populate what was needed at both the association level and the conference level. And so we ended up doing away with associations. So you'll still hear that language when people get ordained. Like when Jenny was ordained, you had this language of conference acting as an association. That's a throwaway line that people don't even hear anymore, but they say that because in our church polity, it's still the associations that are supposed to do the ordaining. Because in the congregational polity, it was a local church that ordained you. So this is an attempt to be as local as possible, while also acknowledging that we don't just want a local church to do that on its own. It needs to have some relationship to other people's, in the sense that if we just let local churches ordain whoever they wanted to, we'd have a lot of pretty unqualified people who are now ordained and could now go serve other churches. So we try to have a framework in place. So the association provided that level of framework.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you on that
Sure.
Jim Jones was
Right.
ordained by kind of an
Right.
evangelistic arm.
So Jim Jones, if you remember that whole story and the Kool-Aid and all that stuff, was a disciples minister.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ordained in a there got to be some understanding of there's some danger to having everything so locally. Plus, so now what the understanding is that I get ordained by an association, by a collection of churches who have all done, like there's some rigors to that. There's some accountability at a different level than you would get just at a local church, who might raise up somebody internally that they really like, but who may have all kinds of issues. So that's how that polity works. We're now ordained to that. So we had an association in Oklahoma. I actually became president of that association not very long into my life in ministry. I think I was still in seminary. And the whole purpose of me becoming president of the association was to shut the association down. Yeah. So that was my first and only duty as president of the Oklahoma Association, was to shut that down. And that's where I got to know Paul a little bit, and a couple of members of this church who were involved in that work. So I knew of the church. I got to meet Russ once while I was in seminary. Russ had maybe just retired from here. So I started seminary in 2004, and Russ had just retired from here then. And I think he was still doing some stuff. This is before he had, I think he was already starting treatment at that point for his cancer, but was not noticeably, I didn't know he had cancer. And that may not have been a public thing at that point. But he was at the seminary at Phillips doing some stuff, and I got to meet him once or twice there. But that's the extent of my connection with Russ. Leslie Penrose and Paul Ashby. Yeah. Yeah. So the history of this church is that, this is from 2000 to now. So at 2000, we've now been an open and affirming church for a few years, starting to kind of live into that. And we started doing a lot of work at Pride parades. Right? So this is after Russ has left and Paul is here. This is Paul and Pam, his wife. And back when we used to get a booth, and we would host a booth and have that for the church. This was also the time you had Jeremy here, who's literally standing in that picture right there, because that's the door behind him, right? Jeremy and his wife, who were here. This son right here just graduated from college. Yeah. And then I just saw Bill going by, slightly less flamboyantly than he is here in this picture. And Donna Rabel.
I saw that picture in one of the books. I said,
Yeah.
That's got to go out somewhere.
Yeah.
That's just so Bill.
And this is probably also, it could be at a Pride parade, it could be at something else. But you see, we still have this banner back in the closet somewhere. Yeah. So this was Russ, the article in the paper. This is 04, August of 04, as he is retiring and leaving the church. Right. Pastor retiring after 36 years here. Bill Sherman, the famous, there's Lonnie Snyder. And this right here is Stephanie Saldana, who just came again last year and did a book signing here with Magic City Books, and told me she had been here before when Russ was minister, and there she is in the picture. That was with her first book. So Stephanie Saldana is an author who writes a lot about, she herself currently a Christian living in Jerusalem, in the area of Jerusalem, so Eastern Christian. So Bill Sherman wrote this article. For those of you who have been around with the Tulsa World a long time, Bill Sherman was the longtime religion writer. Here's my unasked for editorial comment on religion writers. Bill Sherman is a very good writer. Bill Sherman, like lots of religion writers, doesn't know very much about religion. He knew a lot about his religion. He was a conservative Christian guy. Again, a very thoughtful guy and a good writer. But he made lots of assumptions about religion, particularly across an interfaith lens, that were inaccurate. His opening line for the article on Russell retiring is, "Liberal is not a dirty word to Russell Bennett."
It's like, oh, well, duh.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I think those of you who knew Russ would know that he had a very different take on what it meant to be liberal. He had a very UCC take on what it meant to be liberal. Liberal to him was less about a political stance, though it had those elements. It was more about his reaction, his interaction with his faith. And liberal meant you were open to new ideas, you were thoughtful, you used your brain, you engaged with new information as it came to you. So that was how he kind of embraced that idea. His actual practice of church, as we talked about last week, was actually pretty what we might think of as conservative. It was pretty high church. It was pretty traditional. He was pretty traditional in his appearance and approach, but his ideas were quite progressive. Yeah. Liberal is not, as he says in the article, liberal is not the opposite of conservative. The opposite of liberal is authoritarian. Think about that for a second. He would be having a conniption were Russell still alive. Yeah. There are two different ways of approaching reality. He said one is that we have this truth, this is it, and the other says, no, we have a view of the truth, and you have a view of the truth. That's his idea of what liberalism means. Nobody really possesses the truth. So at 67, he retired here. He was raised in Southern California, the ENR Church, and before coming here. Yep. And then this is using the same picture. This is August 29th of 2006, then the notice of his death in the paper. And obviously a previous picture from when he first came here. Yeah. Yeah. So we had he died at 69 years old. Had a memorial service here on September 9th of 2006 at 10 a.m. and it was, let's say, well attended. So that was, Glenn had already been hired here as the music director, but Glenn has lots of talents, and one of them was technology, AV stuff. So Glenn made it happen. So the sanctuary was obviously totally filled. This room was totally filled. The one of the classrooms was totally filled, and the what we call the multi-purpose room was totally filled. And they had audio visual, feed to all of these areas. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Wasn't this kind of traumatic for the congregation, the way he died? I mean, in my home congregation, we had fans go to church, kind of like Joe Unger is like, treasure for 30 plus years. To have him go through cancer is like,
Right.
so, I think feeling among the community, like, here's a good man, and this is the way God treats him.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yes, it was quite a dramatic impact on the congregation. Not to mention the fact that Russ retires in 2004 with the plan of being the pastor emeritus and still sort of being around and having, some connection to the church. I have my own issues with that as a strategy. I think that would have been problematic in different ways, but he literally, the room that we have in here as a clothes closet right now was going to be his pastor emeritus office. And then, so they hired an interim to come in and do some interim work. That went poorly. This was a person who ended up having a lot of mental health issues, and there was sort of a crisis around that, and there was some legal ramifications for that. There was suing and countersuing and all of that kind of stuff. It got quite ugly. Jeremy, when he was here, and even in our previous discussions, who was present for all of that, didn't even really want to talk about it. He was like, it was really bad. And for the longest time, there was a NDA, non-disclosure agreement on all that. So there were certain people in the church who couldn't talk about it. The people who really knew the inside part of that couldn't talk about it for a long time. That was such a, to have the stability, it's almost impossible for someone to be at a church and be loved at a church. I mean, not just be there, but to be there for 36 years and to have that leaving be graceful in any sort of way. It's very, very challenging. You have to bring somebody in for that interim work who's really, really skilled at that. And so when you bring somebody in who was not only not skilled, but was disastrous in the other direction, it just kind of compounded that. And so it was very, very disruptive and to the church. And you were around during that time, right? What was your experience as a member?
Well, I was brand new, so I didn't know all the details.
Right.
I knew that there had been, I guess the person had talked about things that they shouldn't have.
Right.
Members and things like that, so I kind of got my own distance.
Yeah.
But I knew a lot of the people that had been here a long time,
Yeah.
and I know they had issues.
Yeah, it was a very dramatic time. So to couple that with, I'm not sure in that timeline when the understanding that Russ has cancer comes public, right? But that's within that framework. I do know that for those of you who know Steve Cranford, Steve was a longtime disciples minister who did lots of work in the city and was kind of known as really very widely respected and known as a real bridge building kind of guy. Was also, big guy and had this sort of commanding. So he wasn't aggressive, but he had this commanding presence, right? He was a very, very rational and yeah. So he came in and did and kind of filled out some interim period and helped write things, and he had some training around that and knew what to do and helped kind of keep things, stabilize things to a certain degree. Yeah, did a lot of grieving. So the church would have had enough grieving to do just at Russ retiring, but to have him retire and then die was a really big blow to the church. It's actually rather remarkable that we are still here. Lots of other churches have completely collapsed in that kind of a framework. So
Steve's widow, Myrna, is a part of our congregation.
she is indeed singing in the choir right now. Yeah. Steve's widow. Yeah, Myrna. Yeah. Yeah. So Steve helped stabilize things, and then there was a transition at that point to Paul Ashby coming on board.
And I'm in agreement with the pastor emeritus part. Like in the Methodist church, there's kind of like a strict rule, like unspoken rule that, especially the minister's been there a long time, once they retire, they go away, for a year or two.
Yeah.
Let the congregation adjust, and then they come back. And that's not always
So I don't know timing-wise about all of, but we do have one piece here. So in July of '05, in the newsletter, we're welcoming Steve Cranford as our interim minister. We'll have a reception for Steve and his wife, Myrna Jones. So plan to wear your name tags. And then over here is the search committee report. So the search committee is a unanimous vote in June of 2005 to call Paul Ashby. So that decision has been made, and they're going to have a potluck dinner on August 20th. So he'll start at some point after that. I don't think it says in there when. Paul will preach a call sermon on the 21st, and then he'll start at some point after that. So Steve's interim was not a very long period of time before Paul came.
Well, to Violet's point, that was part of the issue, that distancing, because Russ had agreed to that, and he was actually attending Community of Hope because he wasn't supposed to be attending both.
Right.
And so the congregation really didn't get to say goodbye. You know,
Here comes our graduate.
And I'm told if I really want to flaunt it, I can put initials after my name.
Yes, you can. Yes, you can. Not any initials, but you can put, yes. Yeah, I think,
maybe a distance from the congregation.
right.
For that reason, and then there was this, distance, and then there was the illness, and then the death, and so that really, his memorial service is really the first time a lot of people have been able to kind of reconnect with him, as it were.
Yeah, it was deeply traumatic, I think, in lots of different ways, and extended into, there could have been some argument made for a longer, genuine interim period, right? Because of the disaster of the previous interim period. I mean, Steve came in and did a remarkable job in a short period of time, but it really needed to be a longer period of time because, not too long after this, you have Paul is here, and to be fair to Paul, to try to come in that kind of arrangement, here's the honest truth. When you get called to a church and you're going through that interview, churches are not always totally forthcoming about what's really going on with them, right? And so you don't really know what you're stepping into. And for him to step into that, a church that is grieving deeply, and then Russ is still alive. And then just months later, Russ has passed, and you're now doing this giant funeral for the previous pastor who was there for 36 years is an immense task for somebody to come in and try to do. Yeah. So Paul came to us from Kent, Ohio. He had a long period of being a pastor prior to coming here in Ohio, Connecticut, and California. He had a doctorate of ministry from Colgate and a master of theology from Princeton. Yep. Yep. Yeah, right. Paul, for those of you who knew Paul was an immensely studious guy. Paul is an immensely studious guy. I inherited, probably a quarter of the books that I have in there from just Paul had, a voracious reader like Russ. Voracious reader and very, very bright, very, very smart guy. And he and Pam came in, and Pam, for those of you who knew Pam and Paul were a bit of an odd couple, right? They just had real different reactions to how they dealt with people and did things and approached stuff. So,
She was a social worker, so it was a
right.
little bit different.
Yeah, and she was a social worker, yeah, and she had some different skills than he had, and it was, anyway. So they came, and then, yeah, there's baby Glenn sitting right over here, right? Yeah. So that was 05, so that was August of 05 that Glenn gets hired. So again, he's not here very long before you have this big funeral and all of that kind of stuff. So he's kind of in the midst of all of that too, right?
Okay, in '05, was Elizabeth the director of Council Oak then?
I don't know if she would have been around. Let's see, 05.
Elizabeth was part of Council Oak twice.
Yeah, right, yeah.
There were people in between, so her two stints. That was 20 years.
Yeah. It would have just been starting. Council Oak would have just been starting. Yeah. Council Oak started as Rick Fortner started, who is actually retiring at All Souls soon. And Rick Fortner started Council Oak as for a World AIDS Day, just gathered together singers to do this choral piece for a World AIDS Day. And it was such a good thing for all of those folks. It eventually kind of morphed into that. Oh, wait, that's a huge leap. Did I put those? I think I probably did. Because I can't speak very much to Paul's tenure here, other than I knew him very well outside of things, outside of church life. I don't know. Some of you were here when Paul was here.
I know some people had some different opinions of him. I liked him a lot, but I liked things about him. There's things I didn't like about him, but overall he was a decent guy.
Yeah.
Versus, I'm not naming names, but there's other people who are still here for the long completely.
Yeah. Well, he was here for about 8 years, which was, again, a very long tenure given the atmosphere into which he stepped.
He was a very cerebral person.
Mm-hmm.
When it came to things like a book study, it was a very interesting class, but his pastoral skills kind of lacked a little. He was not very compassionate to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
There was a particular funeral.
Okay.
that didn't work
Well,
out.
like I don't really want to get into the details, of
It just kind of
yeah.
explained how
This becomes harder, like as we get closer and in our history, and these are people that you actually know, and it's not a Jackson Smith who we're assembling from writings and stuff, but somebody who you may have had encounters with. It's very easy to get into those kind of personal details, and it's not my task at all to critique previous pastors, just to say their role and what their role here was. Towards the end of Paul's tenure, then he accepted a job in Seattle, I believe, or in the Washington State area, and left. And so here's what happened for me. I'm a second career pastor. I was attending Phillips, still living in Oklahoma City, and was currently, at that point when I first started seminary, was a member at Mayflower and had been for many years. And came back to seminary, and about a year into my seminary, Robin Myers, the pastor at Mayflower, came to me and said, well, there's been this anonymous gift given to further the cause of the UCC in Oklahoma. And he, along with Kathy McCallie, who was at Open Arms at the time, were considering starting, where would you start a church? And their number one thing was Norman. They thought Norman was the best candidate for that. Maybe Stillwater a close second, but College Town, start one there. So let's start one in Norman. And they had a candidate who was himself in seminary at Pacific School of Religion, and the timing of that didn't quite work out, or he didn't want to do it. I can't remember how that all worked out, but Robin came and asked me, would you consider being a part of this? We had gone down and have a couple exploratory meetings at the home of Don and Kay Holliday in Norman, who were members at Mayflower but living in Norman. Don, for those of you who don't know, Don was the lead attorney for the group that originally started the suit to sue for marriage equality. Kay has been the head of PFLAG in Norman for 1,000 years and has been on the national board as well. Don was part of the group that I remember the Sunday as we were setting up church in Norman that he came to me and said, well, I think we found our plaintiffs. I think we found this couple in Tulsa, which ended up being Mary and Sharon Bishop Baldwin. So anyway, doing that work in Norman, starting that church there, then ended up going back up to Mayflower after about 4 years doing that work in Norman. Was the associate pastor at Mayflower and was doing that, and Robin has a similar tenure to Russ. He had been at he was doing his 30th anniversary, I think, at the time at Mayflower, and Edith Guffey, who was our conference minister, came to me and said, I know you want to stay in Oklahoma because your family's all here. If you ever want to be a senior minister, there's only about 12 churches in Oklahoma. When one of them comes open, you need to pay attention. And this may feel early to you, I don't know, but like, you ain't taking over here at Mayflower for quite some time because Robin's not going anywhere. And fellowship is opened in Tulsa. Would you consider thinking that through? So after a long period of time and many interviews and all that sort of stuff, I decided to come here, right, and started on December 1st of 2013. Yeah. Yeah. And so there was a period of time for a few months after Paul left in the spring, late spring. There were a few months in which the pulpit was filled by people within the congregation and a few folks from outside and that sort of thing before I came on the first Sunday of Advent in 2013. On that Sunday, we also had Scott and Mark came to me and said, after the first sermon I preached here, they came to me and said, look, I know it's your first Sunday and everything, but the World AIDS Day celebration is planned for tonight, and the place where we've planned it, there used to be a group called the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, which you may remember, who did drag but dressed up as nuns. And the place where we were going to hold the World AIDS Day service was offended by that and did not want to host the service any longer. Can we host it here tonight? And
Tonight.
yeah. So my first Sunday was, okay, let's do it. Yeah. Learning the skills of improv, yes and. You might also notice that back in 2013 I still wore ties. Ridiculous.
So how old were your boys then?
The boys were, in 2013, the boys were 11 and 10 and 11, 10, 11 and 12, something like that. So Ian had just finished 6th grade. He was in 6th grade on December 1st. They were still living in Oklahoma City at this time. And Alec was finishing 4th grade. He would have started 5th grade. Yeah. And then the classic Chris Moore gesture. That was American Sign Language. So we used to have, this is the old sign, and we used to have, it's the old top of the sign. We changed this out. So we used to have a interpreter because of Danielle's dad, who...
yes, he would bring.
Yes, yeah. And so who had partial hearing, and so Brittany did that for years, right? Even after your dad passed, we had Brittany on for, I don't know, maybe another 2 years.
You paid for part of her salary.
And in part because she was such a beautiful signer. She had this art to things. And she would sign during the anthems, and people just liked watching her sign. They had no idea what the sign language was, but they liked watching her sign. She had this sort of rhythmic dance kind of thing, and she's such a lovely person. So we kept her on for quite some time, but we eventually, as we decided to change that sign out, it was actually after we had let Brittany go. Brittany was actually moving on to other things in her life anyway. She was having kids and all that stuff. So, but we had the ASL up there with some false advertising for about a year until we changed that part of the sign out. But the sign was my big thing that I was not told during my interview is that you're going to have this sign you have to do every week, right? I didn't think it was that big of a deal, and to be honest with you, it came during Paul's tenure. It was, or right at the transition, maybe right at the end of Russ and into Paul. I don't think Russ was in favor of it, Russ had a few years. I remember now. Somebody told me Russ had a couple years with it. All he wanted up there was worship times or special services or things like that. He didn't put anything else up there, which I actually appreciate because it's quite challenging to find things to put up there that are meaningful, that are that short. But we've done it. We really became. You can see the old pews, right? This picture is from a piece that was done in the Tulsa People magazine.
I remember that.
Yeah.
That's Judy and Mary.
Yeah, it's Judy and Mary. Yeah. And then we just became known for these signs, and I would put stuff up like that, and we'd get calls. The calls that we got on this sign were not because we were a church celebrating pride, but a church that used she for God.
One of my aunts even commented on Facebook, she?
Yeah. It's so funny that you would ask people, because they would call in and we'd say, well, do you think God is a man? And there'd be this pause, and then they'd go, well, no. I think you do. I think you do, actually. And then we did our Pride Parade, continue with the Pride Parade. We had this one year where we put together these doors. So Mark and Scott had this idea that we would paint these doors, and we actually had them out in front of the church displayed for the month of June. And then we put them on these casters, and we drug them through the streets of Tulsa. Well, it's hard on your car driving through the streets of Tulsa. Those casters, one of the doors for the last maybe quarter mile, I was holding the door up because the caster had totally broken, and we were just doing this for like the last quarter mile. But there's lots of folks. There's Alec, Kathy and Alec holding that door. Alec has his rainbow socks on. Yeah, this is the most recent one. This is last year's. Yeah. So it would have. You can take the guy out of lawyering, but you can't really take it out, right? So this is one of our most special memories, I think. And I had hoped to have the video, and I just can't find it anywhere. I know we have it. So this was a year. You can kind of see back here in the background that there's a person standing here, and there was a person over behind this area.
Is that Alia in the blue right there?
This is Alia, yeah. And that's Kara Joy Perry McKee, who was a city council, not at that point.
I think that the person in the blue right there at the end of the road is me.
Could be.
So,
This is this you down here,
I think
yeah. So for about 4 weeks, maybe even longer, 5 weeks prior to Easter of this year, which would have been 2016, I think. We had protesters here at the church. Now, this was a group that called themselves Abolish Human Abortion, and they called themselves abolitionists. They saw abortion. In their logic, abortion was the same thing as slavery. Like we were working to free human life. So they had that same sort of righteousness to them. And a very John Brown, almost John Brown-ish level of intensity about that. It was a group that I was familiar with. We had dealt with them in Oklahoma City at Mayflower, and I knew the leader of that group personally. He and I had sit down and tried to have a conversation at one point. It didn't go well, and so they had come out to protest us. And so they were there every Sunday, some during the week, but mostly on Sundays, and they knew exactly where to stand, what their legal rights were. They knew all of that stuff. They would stand and they had their bullhorns and they would make, their... My approach to this was the same as it had been at Mayflower, which was we would go out and try to engage in polite conversation, and that never went well and never accomplished anything. So then the approach was ignore them. And so we did that for weeks and weeks and weeks. We wondered as we were heading towards Easter, what are they going to do? Well, there they were on Easter morning. And by that point, Alia Shimi here, who was then the outreach director at the Islamic Society of Tulsa, who is now the executive director at Tulsa Metropolitan Ministry, and we were probably acquaintances at that point. We are dear, dear friends now, but we had gone. I had organized an event at the mosque just maybe a few months before, where we stood in solidarity with Muslims who were under heavy attack at that point culturally. And so she was, as she said, well, I'll be damned if somebody's going to come to my friend's place on Easter. It's Easter. Why aren't they in church? That was her thing. And so she organized this rally. One of the toughest parts of this was that, as you know, our children have to walk across here to go to the education wing. And not only did they yell things at our children through their bullhorns, but they trolled people online, and so they knew by the people's face what their name was, and they would call them by name. Not the kids, but the adults who were leading them over, right? They'd call them by name. And so that was off-putting, right? I do recall very clearly heading out to my car, parked out in this corner, and they were standing right on that very corner by the fire hydrant. It was after church had been over, and I was walking with the boys out to my car, and they were, yelling things like, your dad's a baby killer, and all of that kind of stuff at my children. And I can't remember exactly what was said, but the boys were already in the car, and I remember opening the door, and I was getting into the car, and whatever he said was angering enough to me that I stopped, and I stood back up again, and I was about to turn, and I remember distinctly Ian saying, "Dad, just get in the car, let's go." And so I just got in the car, and we drove away. This was Easter Sunday. When we went to set our kids off to children's church, here was this line of people, none of whom were Christian, standing there with their umbrellas blocking the view of the people out there with their bullhorns, and they were singing. They were singing "All You Need Is Love," which is the only song that they all knew, right? So as I released the kids and we opened up the doors of the sanctuary, and I was the one, I could stand in the center aisle. I could hear them very clearly singing All You Need Is Love. And they had kazoos and a tambourine and stuff like that as our kids went walking across. And it actually ended up for us, I don't know I'm pretty sure what the intent of that group was, but what it ended up being for us was a powerful moment of connection and community that we could not have gotten without their outrageous actions.
I heard that you can have did signs and stapled signs to utility poles with really graphic.
Yeah, very graphic pictures. Yeah.
About the same time, I mean, prior to this, it seems like I remember the Muslim, they had a fundraiser at the hotel, and
Mhm.
kind of had a reverse protest and praise and support, because this is the time we're having Muslim bands.
Right. So we had the
So this was kind of a perfect response, like, well,
Yeah.
you were there for us, so we're going to be there for you.
Yeah. It was really a lovely thing. It's just become a central part of our identity, I think, as a church. The other big component that happened was, of course, COVID. Right? And that's been a shaping thing for us as a church in really dramatic ways. So this was one of our first worship services where we met outdoors and we sang, the choir all has masks on outside. We met out in the parking lot, crossed our fingers on the weather, worked out okay, dragged the piano outside. We've done different kinds of things worship-wise, set up this, we did worship in the round for 1 month in here. This is, of course, that's what worship looked like.
And the lights are still.
Yeah, the lights are still up. This is what worship looked like during COVID, of course. Yeah, for a long time. Is that it? Oh, that's it. Yeah. It's been a lot of, the last 25 years may have brought as much or more change than the first 50. We've just had some pretty dramatic moments here, a lot of them foisted upon us. And I think as we think about the next 25-year block, we have no way to know what that is going to look like. And really everything is on the board. The single most challenging thing for most churches in maybe their whole history has been COVID and the impact of a pandemic. For us, it has grown us. It has changed us. It has given us some new tools for how we interact and how we not only do that with each other, but how we reach out into the world. And I think it's empowered us in lots of ways to think about the kind of voice that we offer as a church. So that's a very positive thing.
Didn't you say things like, we got like a 30% gain in membership after we came back from COVID?
Yeah, so lots of churches saw people leave, obviously as you went out from in-person worship, those people never came back to in-person worship. We got a huge bump, in part because I think we're trying at least to speak to a hunger that's out there. Social scientists are now calling it the 3 Bs. People are searching for belief, belonging, and behavior. Right, so where can I find a place that gives me all of these things? The paper that Rabbi and I are working on for my doctorate of ministry it calls that ethics, community, and transcendence. It's not nearly as alliterative, but it's, there's something, people are looking for something bigger than themselves. So first of all, they're looking for belonging. They're looking to find a place where they connect with people who are, on the same wavelength or close, that they feel that connection to. They are looking for a sense of how do we live in the world, and how do I get reminded about what's a good way to live in the world, your ethics. And then I would argue they're looking for more than just a system of belief. They're looking for something that's bigger. How do I have an experience of something that's bigger than me? And you can get one or two of those from lots of places. But our argument is that it's religious communities that hold the key to all three of those in the same place.
I think kind of standing up for something, like I was, and I know we didn't do it to get recognition, but like when we had the nativity scene with the kids,
Mm-hmm.
because of the children. And what was amazing to me was it got the attention of the papers, publications back east. So they were kind of like, my take on it was that it's like, wait a minute, this is in Red State, Oklahoma, and there's a congregation there that's standing up for the immigrants. It's like, we didn't expect that, so I think that's what made it newsworthy.
Maybe so. So that for those of you who don't know, that was a year that we used to put out a nativity scene out in front of, we just had these stand-up plywood, nativity scene thing, and we put a chain link fence around it because this was the year in which they were detaining children at the border and placing them in these camps, and so we put this fence around it, and we talked about the Holy Family as a migrant family, and we did it. And that was something I totally stole from other congregations who had done that in other places, but they hadn't done it in Tulsa. And so I think that was a factor. So yeah, we did get, New York Times and Washington Post coverage on that. And it came and went, but it's kind of given us that marker of a place that is making that ethical statement out into the world, which, again, I hope we can see from our history we've done so many times. That's the reason we talk about this history, is that we've seen how that's happened with various leaders throughout I'm not doing anything new here. I'm doing a new version of that same truth-telling, but that's been going on since our foundation in 1950. Now I have a congregation who's going along with it, as opposed to some other times in history when that's not been the case. Yeah. So we're looking forward to another 25 years, and I will not be here for those additional 25 years, just to be clear. Oh, I do know. Yeah. So, that's the thing to think about is, how are we shaping for the next iteration of what fellowship is going to be. It's the same problem I've been talking about in lots of different ways. This building that we're in right now is almost 75 years old, and portions of the rest of the building are getting much older too. Even the newest part of our building is still 25 years old. So we've just got lots of costs and repair around keeping the building up, and so there's a legit question that lots of churches are facing, not just us. What does it look like to occupy a building as a congregation? Is that the mark of a church in the 21st century, that we have a building? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I could make lots of different arguments around that. But there's at least some room for us to think about that, as well as for us to think about what could a congregation that is as blessed as we are financially, which we indeed are, and which has 5.5 acres in Midtown Tulsa at a time that we have huge housing issues, what could we dream? Like what other kind of statement could we make as we move into the next iteration of things? So our friend Alia Shimi, who is executive or now CEO at TMM, new title for her, they are starting a project. I'm chair of the board, so I'll say we are starting a project at Yale and Pine. There's about 29 acres that TMM owns there. We're establishing a bazaar, Bazaar, which will be a food desert resource. It will be vending machines with farm-to-table fresh produce. It's a whole different model. We'll see how that works, including food trucks that are housed right there. So the kids who are at the 2 local schools right around there will get a free meal every day of the week at the food trucks. And we'll have the TMM headquarters are there. Eventually, you're going to have a coffee shop on the corner of Pine and Yale, and you're going to have mixed-use retail housing development all on that same block. So you think about replicating that model. What if you replicated it right here? Right? So there's all kinds of things that we can think about and imagine down the road. But yay for 75 years. Thanks all for coming. Yeah. Remember